Some discoveries don't disappear because they were proven wrong. They disappear because someone decided the explanation was good enough. A label was applied, a report was filed, and the questions quietly stopped. In this episode, we're not chasing wild theories. We're revisiting discoveries that were officially explained, and then slowly removed from serious discussion. Not because the mystery ended, but because the file was closed. In 1936, during routine excavation work near modern-day Baghdad, archaeologists uncovered an object that didn't resemble anything they were looking for. It wasn't ornate, it wasn't ceremonial, it wasn't impressive at first glance. It was a small clay jar, about the size of a human hand. Inside it, there was a rolled copper cylinder. At the center of that cylinder, an iron rod. The opening at the top was sealed with asphalt. No inscriptions, no decoration, no written explanation. Just a container, built with unusual precision. At first, the object was catalogued and stored with little attention. It didn't fit neatly into any known category of ancient artifacts. But it also didn't look accidental. Everything about it felt intentional: the materials, the alignment, the sealing. Years later, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig noticed something strange. The structure wasn't symbolic, it wasn't structural. It was functional: copper, iron, an acidic residue inside the jar. Koenig proposed an idea that, at the time, sounded almost absurd. What if this wasn't a container at all? What if it was a device? Specifically, a battery. When replicas were constructed using the same materials and filled with mild acidic solutions, they produced a small but measurable electric charge. Not powerful, not dangerous, but real. Enough to plate metal, enough to transfer energy. Enough to raise an uncomfortable question: if this object really was a battery, it would mean that electrical knowledge existed nearly 2,000 years earlier than accepted history allowed. That possibility made people uneasy. The official response came quickly. Historians and museum authorities offered a simpler explanation: the jar was likely used to store scrolls, or religious relics, or ceremonial objects. The electrical interpretation, they said, was speculative, unnecessary, overreaching. And so, the explanation was labeled, case closed. No large-scale testing followed. No excavation campaigns were launched to find similar objects nearby. No institutional push was made to understand why such a device would exist. The object was reclassified. Its description softened, its implications reduced. Over time, it stopped appearing in serious academic discussions. But here's the part that doesn't quite sit right. If the jar were simply a container, its design would make little sense. The asphalt seal prevents easy access, the internal metals serve no storage purpose. And the alignment is far too precise for something meant to hold parchment. Even more curious, the electroplated artifacts from the same region and era exist. Objects coated with thin layers of metal so even that modern historians still debate how they were made. The battery theory would explain them cleanly. Too cleanly, perhaps. Because once you accept that explanation, other questions follow. Who built it? Why was it built? And how much knowledge existed that never made it into the historical record? Those questions are harder to control. So, instead, the safer path was chosen. The Baghdad battery became a curiosity, a footnote, a what-if story for documentaries and trivia books. Not a research priority. Today, the artifact remains real. The replicas still work. And the materials still tell the same story. But the investigation stopped decades ago, not because the evidence failed, but because the explanation was deemed sufficient. And once an explanation feels acceptable, history has a way of moving on, even if something important gets left behind. In 1901, a group of sponge divers seeking shelter from a storm made an unexpected discovery off the coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera. What they found wasn't a temple, it wasn't a shipwreck filled with gold. It was debris, broken statues, fragments of wood, corroded bronze lumps pulled from the sea floor. Most of it looked unremarkable, damaged, eroded, difficult to identify, until someone noticed the gears. At first, they appeared as nothing more than jagged bronze fragments fused together by centuries of corrosion. Once they were cleaned, something unsettling became clear. These weren't decorative pieces. They weren't mechanical scraps. They were precisely cut gears, interlocking, layered, designed to move in coordination. Over 30 bronze gears, some smaller than a coin, arranged inside what was once a wooden casing. Nothing like this was supposed to exist in the ancient world. According to accepted history, gear-driven mechanical systems of this complexity wouldn't appear until medieval Europe, more than 1,000 years later. And yet, here it was. As researchers studied the fragments, the picture became even stranger. The gears weren't random. They followed mathematical ratios, aligned with known astronomical cycles. When reconstructed, the device revealed its function. It could predict eclipses, track the movements of the sun and moon, model planetary cycles with astonishing accuracy. In modern terms, it wasn't just a machine. It was a computer, an analog computational device, capable of modeling the cosmos. Built around 100 BCE, the implications were staggering. If this level of engineering existed, then ancient Greek technology wasn't primitive. It was advanced, deliberately precise, and largely undocumented. The response from the academic world came quickly and carefully. The mechanism was real. Yes, it was sophisticated, but the explanation offered was narrow. This was a one-off, a unique masterpiece, the work of a lone genius or a small group with knowledge that went no further, an anomaly. The explanation worked. By isolating the device as an exception, history remained intact. No need to rewrite timelines. No need to ask how such knowledge was lost. The Antikythera mechanism became remarkable, but irrelevant, a technological dead end. There's a problem with that explanation. Complex machines don't emerge in isolation. They require prior versions, failed prototypes, incremental improvement. You don't accidentally build a device with dozens of interlocking gears tuned to astronomical cycles without a tradition behind it. And yet, no earlier examples were acknowledged. No workshops were identified. Schools of mechanical engineering from the era were seriously investigated. Even more curious, the mechanism was discovered by chance. A storm, a detour, a diver looking for shelter. How many others were lost? How many were melted down, repurposed, or misidentified before anyone knew what to look for? Those questions lingered, but the explanation had already been accepted, so research slowed, funding was limited, public attention faded. The device became a museum piece, admired but rarely interrogated. No longer treated as evidence of a missing chapter in technological history. It was treated as a curiosity. Today, the Antikythera mechanism is still described as the world's first computer. But that phrase hides more than it reveals. Because calling something the first invites a follow-up question. What came before? And that's a question history never really pursued. Not because it couldn't, but because the explanation was sufficient. And once a discovery is neatly explained, even one that shouldn't exist, the file can be closed. In 1912, a rare book dealer named Wilfred Voynich purchased a collection of old manuscripts from a Jesuit college in Italy. Most of them were ordinary, religious texts, scholarly works, catalogued, translated, understood. But one book stood apart. It had no title, no author, no known language. Its pages were filled with flowing script, letters that looked intentional, rhythmic, and consistent, yet belonged to no alphabet on earth. The illustrations were even stranger. Plants that didn't exist, astronomical diagrams that didn't match known systems. Human figures immersed in elaborate networks of tubes, pools, and circular structures. Nothing about the manuscript felt random, and nothing about it made sense. Radiocarbon dating later placed the parchment in the early 15th century. The ink was genuine. The wear was authentic. This wasn't a modern forgery, which left only one possibility. Someone, centuries ago, had written an entire book in a language no one could recognize. As word spread, the manuscript attracted attention from some of the best minds of the modern era. Cryptographers tried to break it. Linguists searched for patterns. Statisticians analyzed letter frequency. Even codebreakers from World War II were brought in. They all failed. The text wasn't gibberish. It followed linguistic rules. It had structure, repetition, grammar-like behavior, but it resisted every attempt at translation. As decades passed, pressure mounted for an explanation. And eventually, one arrived. The prevailing theory became simple and comforting. The Voynich manuscript was a hoax, an elaborate fake, a meaningless text designed to look complex. possibly created to deceive a wealthy buyer. The explanation spread quickly because it solved the problem without creating new ones. If the book meant nothing, then no further questions were necessary. But there was a problem. Creating a hoax like this would have been extraordinarily difficult. The statistical structure of the text doesn't match random writing. The word patterns shift depending on page sections, as if different topics were being discussed. The illustrations align with the text layout, suggesting intentional correspondence. This wasn't someone scribbling nonsense. It was someone writing something. More troubling still, no definitive proof of the hoax theory has ever been produced. No drafts, no failed attempts, no historical record of anyone admitting to creating it. Just an explanation that felt convenient. Over time, the label stuck. The manuscript became a curiosity, a puzzle without urgency, a famous unsolved mystery that institutions slowly stopped trying to solve. Research funding dried up. Academic papers grew rare. Serious investigation gave way to speculation. The book remained, preserved, photographed, digitized, but effectively shelved. And that's the strange part. Because if the manuscript truly were meaningless, it should be easy to prove. Randomness leaves fingerprints. Hoaxes unravel under pressure. Yet the Voynich manuscript never did. It simply sat there, consistent, silent, unread. Today, it's often described as probably a hoax. Not proven, not demonstrated, just accepted. The explanation closed the file without unlocking the text. And so the book remains exactly what it has always been. A message written by someone who clearly expected to be understood, by someone who never was. Not because the mystery disappeared, but because the explanation was good enough. In 1934, while walking near a stream outside the town of London, Texas, a woman named Maxine L. May made an unremarkable discovery. It looked like an ordinary rock, rough, weathered, heavy in the hand. She brought it home and left it there for years. It wasn't until her son dropped the stone and it cracked open that something strange was revealed. Inside the rock was a hammer, not an impression, not a fossilized outline. A real hammer, iron head, wooden handle, partially encased in solid stone. The wood had mineralized. The metal was corroded, but intact. The shape was unmistakable. At first glance, it resembled a 19th century tool. Simple, functional, nothing exotic. Except for one detail. The rock surrounding it was analyzed and identified as limestone, a type of stone that typically takes thousands, sometimes millions of years to form naturally. That timeline didn't align with the hammer. Modern hammers do not predate human civilization by geological ages. The contradiction was immediate. If the rock was old, the hammer shouldn't exist. If the hammer was modern, the rock shouldn't be. News of the object spread quietly at first, then more widely as photographs circulated. Geologists were asked to weigh in. The explanation came swiftly. The stone, they said, likely formed rapidly around the hammer due to mineral deposits in water-rich environments. A process called concretion. In this view, the hammer was simply dropped, buried, and gradually encased over decades, not millennia. A rare occurrence. But not impossible. The explanation was neat, technically plausible. And it solved the problem. Case closed. But once again, something didn't quite fit. Concretions usually form around organic material or voids. They rarely preserve objects with such clean alignment. And they do not typically mineralize wood to the extent seen here in such a short time span. Even more curious, the iron head showed an unusual level of purity. Low sulfur content. Minimal impurities. Some metallurgists noted that it didn't perfectly match typical industrial iron from the late 1800s. Not impossible, just uncommon. No extensive follow-up studies were conducted. No controlled experiments were commissioned to replicate the conditions. No systematic launch to find similar artifacts in the surrounding area. The hammer was categorized, explained, and quietly removed from serious academic discourse. Over time, it found a new home. Not in geological journals, but in fringe discussions and roadside museums. Once that happened, institutional interest faded completely. The object became contaminated by association. Anything linked to it was now considered unworthy of formal study, and so the explanation stood unchallenged. Today,
The London hammer still exists. You can see photographs of it. You can read short summaries, but you won't find active research programs trying to understand it. Not because the explanation was definitively proven, but because it was sufficient. The story was filed under anomaly resolved, and history moved on. The hammer remained, half tool, half stone, frozen in a contradiction no one felt obligated to revisit. Not because the mystery disappeared, but because asking further questions stopped being encouraged.
On the night of August 15, 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Nothing dramatic, no countdown, no special event. It was quietly listening. The Big Ear radio telescope, operated by Ohio State University, was scanning the sky for unusual radio emissions, part of a long-running SETI program searching for signals that did not originate from Earth. Most nights produced nothing of interest. Static, background noise, predictable interference. Until that night. At 10:16 p.m., the printer connected to the telescope recorded a sudden spike in signal strength. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't faint. It was powerful. So powerful, in fact, that it exceeded every known background signal the telescope had ever recorded. The code printed on the paper was a short string of characters, 6EQUJ5. To anyone else, it meant nothing. But to astronomer Jerry R. Eman, it meant everything. Each character represented signal intensity over time, and this sequence showed a sharp rise, a sustained peak, and a clean decline, exactly what scientists expected from a distant, fixed source in space as the Earth rotated past it. Even more striking was the frequency. The signal was detected at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, a frequency considered special by astronomers. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and this frequency is often described as the most logical channel for an interstellar transmission. Natural sources rarely produce strong, narrow-band signals there. Artificial ones might. Eman circled the code in red pen and wrote a single word beside it. Wow! The name stuck. In the days that followed, astronomers attempted to find the signal again. They pointed the telescope back to the same region of the sky. They adjusted equipment. They waited. Nothing. The wow signal never repeated. That fact became the cornerstone of its explanation. Because a one-time event is easier to dismiss. The official interpretation settled on uncertainty. Perhaps it was a comet. Perhaps a rare natural phenomenon. Perhaps terrestrial interference that went undetected. No definitive source was identified. And so the explanation was framed carefully. Interesting, but inconclusive. Unrepeatable. Unprovable. Case closed. But the details continued to bother those who studied it closely. The signal lasted 72 seconds, the exact amount of time the Big Ear telescope could observe a fixed point in space. It came from a region with no known strong radio sources, and no known satellites or aircraft could account for it. Later analyses showed that the comet explanation didn't fit the signal's intensity or frequency profile, and interference, while always possible, left no trace before or after. What made the situation more troubling wasn't just the signal itself. It was what happened next. Funding for SETI programs declined. The Big Ear telescope was eventually dismantled. Long-term listening projects were scaled back or canceled. The search didn't end. It narrowed. The wow signal became a famous anecdote, a curiosity mentioned in passing. Not a mystery demanding continued observation. Because without repetition, there was no urgency. And without urgency, there was no justification to keep listening. Today, the wow signal still stands as one of the strongest unexplained radio events ever recorded. It has never been conclusively identified as natural. It has never been reproduced. And it has never been fully dismissed. It exists in a narrow space between discovery and dismissal. Acknowledged, catalogued, explained just enough to move on. The red circle and the word, wow, remain, preserved on a faded printout. A moment when something spoke loudly into the void, and no one was listening long enough to hear it again. In the deserts of southern Peru, there is a landscape that refuses to make sense from the ground. At eye level, it looks empty, flat, barren. Just dust, stone and silence stretching for miles. For centuries, people walked across it without noticing anything unusual. Because the discovery only works from above. In the 1920s, as airplanes began flying over the region, pilots started reporting strange shapes carved into the earth. Long, perfectly straight lines, geometric patterns, and enormous figures, birds, monkeys, spiders, some stretching hundreds of meters across. They weren't etched lightly. They were engineered. The darker surface stones had been carefully removed, revealing lighter soil beneath. The contrast was deliberate, the precision unmistakable. These were the Nazca lines. They could only be fully seen from the air, which immediately raised a question no one could ignore. Why would a pre-Columbian civilization create designs meant to be viewed from a perspective they supposedly never had? Archaeologists moved in. Measurements were taken. Maps were drawn. The scale became undeniable. Some lines ran perfectly straight for kilometers, deviating only inches over vast distances. Others aligned with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, celestial risings. This wasn't random art. It was planned, carefully. As public curiosity grew, so did the need for an explanation. And eventually, one was agreed upon. The Nazca lines, experts said, were ceremonial. They were ritual pathways, spiritual symbols, offerings to gods associated with water and fertility. The explanation was elegant, culturally respectful, and academically safe. Case closed. But again, the explanation didn't resolve everything. Ceremonial paths don't require perfect straightness across miles of uneven terrain. They don't demand precise geometry visible only from above. And they don't easily explain why certain figures appear to reference animals not native to the region. Even more puzzling was the logistics. To create these lines, the Nazca people would have needed advanced surveying techniques. They would have needed planning at scale. They would have needed coordination over generations. And yet, no tools for such large-scale measurement were ever found. No grids, no reference markers, no infrastructure to explain how accuracy was maintained without an aerial view. Researchers demonstrated that the lines could be made using ropes and stakes, which answered one question, but raised another. Why go to such lengths, literally, for something no one on the ground could fully see? As the ceremonial explanation took hold, alternative interpretations were quietly set aside. Astronomical calendars were downplayed. Navigation theories dismissed. Any suggestion that the lines served a functional purpose beyond ritual was labeled speculative. Funding followed consensus. Serious inquiry narrowed. The Nazca lines became something to admire, photograph, and explain quickly to tourists, not something to interrogate deeply. And so they were preserved, physically protected, but intellectually contained. Today, the lines still exist exactly as they were made centuries ago. They are mapped, catalogued, understood, and yet, standing on the ground among them, you see nothing. Only when you rise above do the patterns reveal themselves. That contradiction remains. A massive effort, a precise design, a message written at a scale that assumes an observer who isn't there, unless the explanation is incomplete. But once a discovery is labeled ceremonial, once it's framed as symbolic rather than technical, the need to ask further questions disappears. The Nazca lines didn't vanish. They were explained. And in doing so, they stopped demanding answers. In 1992, in a small village in China's Zhejiang province, a local woman made a simple decision. She wanted to drain a pond. The pond was considered ordinary, old, murky. Locals believed it was bottomless. No one expected much to happen. When the water level dropped, stone walls began to emerge. Then steps. Then vertical surfaces, smooth, deliberate, and unmistakably artificial. When the pond was fully drained, it revealed something no one had anticipated. A massive underground cavern, perfectly carved. As more ponds were drained, the scale of the discovery became impossible to ignore. There weren't one or two caves. There were 24. Each one was enormous, some large enough to house entire buildings. Each one carved directly into solid sandstone. Each one supported by towering stone pillars, left in place with surgical precision. And most unsettling of all, every interior surface was marked with the same parallel chisel lines, cut at identical angles, as if the same tool had carved them all. As if the work had been planned and executed as a single project. The Longyu caves had no recorded history. No ancient texts mentioned them. No local legends explained them. No inscriptions dated them. They simply existed. Estimates suggested that removing the amount of stone required would have taken thousands of workers decades, if not centuries, using traditional tools. And yet, there was no debris, no rubble piles, no discarded stone, no evidence of where millions of tons of rock had gone. The caves weren't random. They were geometrically consistent, structurally sound, flood-resistant. They showed no signs of collapse, even after remaining submerged for centuries. Archaeologists moved in quickly. Measurements were taken, theories proposed, and eventually, an explanation was offered. The caves, experts said, were likely ancient quarries, or underground storage spaces, or ceremonial structures whose purpose had been forgotten. The exact function was unclear, but the explanation was deemed sufficient. They were ancient. They were human-made. They were no longer mysterious. Case closed. But the explanation left too much unanswered. Why carve such vast spaces underground when surface construction was easier? Why maintain identical chisel patterns across separate caves? Why leave behind perfectly smooth pillars when structural collapse was not a risk? And perhaps most troubling, why was there no historical record of a project of this magnitude? Even major dynastic works left traces in texts, art, or oral tradition. The Longyu caves left nothing. No soot marks from torches, no signs of habitation, no tools, just stone, cut with intention. After the initial wave of interest, research slowed. The caves were open to tourists. Lights were installed, walkways built. The discovery transitioned from anomaly to attraction. Once that happened, the questions lost urgency. Funding followed visibility, not uncertainty. And uncertainty had already been explained away. Today, the caves are described as an impressive ancient engineering achievement, a phrase that sounds informative, but explains almost nothing, because acknowledging achievement without context avoids the harder problem. Who planned this? Why was it done? And what knowledge was required to execute it so precisely? Those questions remain, but they are rarely asked anymore. The Longyu caves didn't disappear. They were reclassified. From unsolved discovery to historical curiosity to architectural backdrop. And once something becomes familiar, even when it defies explanation, it stops demanding answers. In the middle of the 12th century, in a small village called Woolpit in eastern England, something happened that no one was prepared to explain. It wasn't dramatic at first. No omens, no disasters, just two children. They appeared at the edge of a field, near a series of deep pits used to trap wolves. A boy and a girl. They were small, frightened, and visibly different. Their skin had a greenish tint, not stained, not painted, green. They spoke a language no one in the village recognized. They refused bread and cooked food. They cried and clung to each other, unable to explain where they had come from. Villagers assumed they were lost. But as days passed, the confusion deepened. The children did not respond to Latin, nor to English, nor to any dialect the locals knew. They seemed afraid of daylight, and they pointed to the sun with visible discomfort. Eventually, they were offered raw green beans. Only then did they eat. The boy grew weak soon after arriving and died within months. The girl survived, and slowly, over time, she changed. Her skin lost its green hue. She learned the local language. She adapted. When she could finally speak clearly, she was asked the question everyone wanted answered. Where did you come from? Her response didn't fit any known geography. She said they came from a place called the Land of St. Martin, a world where the sun never shone brightly, where everything was bathed in a kind of permanent twilight, where people lived underground. She described a sudden event, a loud sound, a disorienting light, and then finding herself and her brother in the field near Woolpit. To medieval listeners, the story was unsettling. But what makes it more curious is this. The account wasn't written down by villagers or storytellers. It was recorded by two separate chroniclers of the time, William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, both known for their restraint and skepticism. They treated the event seriously, not as myth, not as allegory, as testimony. For centuries, the story lingered on the edges of history. Then, much later, a modern explanation emerged. The children, experts suggested, were likely Flemish immigrants. Orphans, displaced by conflict, suffering from malnutrition. The green skin? a condition known as chlorosis, caused by anemia and poor diet. The strange language? A foreign tongue misunderstood by locals. The underground world? A child's attempt to describe hiding in forests or mines. The explanation was rational, medical, comforting, and it closed the case. But it didn't answer everything. Chlorosis does not typically produce vivid green pigmentation. It causes pallor, not color. The language was never identified, even approximately, and the girl's detailed description of a twilight world was oddly consistent, even after she adapted to life in England. Most importantly, the explanation relies on assumptions, not evidence. No records of missing Flemish children match the timeline. No proof connects the event to known migrations. Just a story, reinterpreted. Over time, the green children of Woolpit became folklore. A curiosity, a medieval oddity explained away by modern science. And once labeled folklore, it stopped being examined seriously. The chroniclers were trusted. The event was documented. The girl lived out her life in England. But the explanation arrived centuries later, long after the witnesses were gone. Today, the story is usually introduced with a phrase like, most likely, which is another way of saying, we're comfortable enough to move on. The children didn't disappear. They were explained. And once explained, their stories slipped quietly out of history, into the space where unresolved things are allowed to rest.
In 1929, during renovations at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, archivists uncovered a forgotten fragment of parchment. It wasn't large. It wasn't complete. Just part of a map. At first glance, it looked like many others from the age of exploration. Coastlines, compass roses, notes written in elegant Ottoman script. But as scholars examined it more closely, the map began to raise questions it wasn't supposed to. The map was dated to 1513 and signed by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what the map appeared to show. Alongside parts of Europe and Africa, the map depicted the eastern coastline of South America with striking accuracy, far more precise than many European maps from the same period. But that wasn't the problem. The real problem lay further south. The map seemed to show a landmass resembling Antarctica, not ice-covered, but as a coastline. This should have been impossible. Antarctica was officially discovered in the 19th century, and its coastline beneath the ice wouldn't be mapped until the 20th century, using seismic and radar technology. Yet here it was, drawn more than 400 years earlier. Piri Reis himself offered an explanation in the map's marginal notes. He claimed he had compiled the map using older sources, maps from Portuguese explorers, Arabic charts, and, most intriguingly, very old maps, some said to date back to the time of Alexander the Great. The explanation was accepted quickly. The map, scholars said, was a patchwork, an imperfect compilation, errors layered on top of partial knowledge. The southern landmass was dismissed as a distorted extension of South America, or a cartographic guess, or a coincidence. Case closed. But once again, the details refused to cooperate. The coastline on the map didn't match South America's southern contour. It aligned more closely with Antarctica's Queen Maud Land, when the ice is removed. Even more unsettling, the map showed no ice at all. Geologists have long argued that Antarctica has been ice-covered for at least several thousand years. Some estimates push that timeline back much further, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If the map is accurate, then its source material may come from a time when Antarctica's coastline was visible, a time that predates known civilization. That implication made people uneasy, so attention shifted. The map was reframed as an oddity, a curiosity of early cartography, a historical footnote. No sustained effort was made to trace the mysterious source maps Piri Reis mentioned. No institutional push followed to determine how such geographic knowledge could exist. The explanation, compilation error, was enough. Over time, discussion narrowed. The Piri Reis map became something you'd see referenced briefly in documentaries, then quickly contextualized and dismissed. The mystery was acknowledged, but contained. Today, the map is still real. It still exists. Its details haven't changed, but the questions surrounding it are rarely pursued. Who drew the original maps Piri Reis used? What surveying methods did they possess? And how did knowledge of a southern continent, one buried under ice, survive long enough to be copied? Those questions lead somewhere uncomfortable. So instead, the safer path remains. The map is explained, filed, a remarkable artifact, that history prefers to keep at arm's length. Not because it proves anything definitive, but because it hints at something that doesn't fit. And once a discovery points too far outside the accepted timeline, explaining it becomes a way of putting it away. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, American newspapers were filled with stories that now feel out of place. They weren't about politics. They weren't about war. They were about bones. Reports described the discovery of massive human skeletons unearthed during construction projects, farming work, and archaeological digs across the United States. Ohio, Wisconsin, West Virginia, New York. The descriptions were consistent. Skeletons far larger than average, skulls with unusual proportions, femurs that did not match known human measurements. In many cases, the articles mentioned experts being called in. Smithsonian representatives, university-affiliated archaeologists. The finds were documented, photographed, and then, according to the reports, shipped to Washington for further study. And that's where the trail ends. Today, none of those skeletons are on display. None appear in the Smithsonian's public catalogs. None are referenced in official archaeological records. The explanation came later. The reports, historians said, were exaggerated. Journalistic errors. Misidentified remains of large individuals or animals. The giants never existed. Case closed. But the story doesn't disappear that easily, because the volume of reports is difficult to ignore. Dozens of newspapers, across different states and decades, described similar discoveries using similar language. Some included measurements. Some referenced named officials. Some noted that the remains were taken for institutional study. This wasn't a single hoax. It was a pattern. Even more curious, these reports abruptly stopped. By the early 20th century, stories of giant skeletons vanished from mainstream media entirely. No formal retractions were issued. No comprehensive debunking was published. The narrative simply shifted. Human history, we were told, was settled. There was no room for anomalies of that scale. When researchers later attempted to trace the original artifacts, they ran into dead ends. Records were missing. Correspondence led nowhere. Collections listed in early documents no longer existed. The Smithsonian denied ever possessing such remains, which raised an uncomfortable question. If the discoveries were fictional, why were they taken seriously at the time? And if they were real, why was there no trace left behind? The most common explanation today is institutional housekeeping. Early archaeology was messy. Standards were inconsistent. Artifacts were lost, mislabeled, or discarded. A plausible answer, but it doesn't explain why this specific category of discovery disappeared so completely, nor why it stopped being discussed altogether. The idea of giants, historians argue, conflicted with established models of human evolution. It echoed biblical narratives. It invited speculation. Better to dismiss it. Better to move on. Over time, the story of the Smithsonian giants became radioactive. Mentioning it marked you as unserious. Questioning it invited ridicule. And that, more than any official denial, ensured silence. Today, the newspapers still exist. The articles can still be read. They describe discoveries that were real enough to be excavated, measured, and transported. What's missing are the remains themselves. No skeletons. No storage records. No institutional trail. Just explanations offered long after the fact. The official position is clear. Nothing unusual ever existed. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was lost. And yet, history offers us a strange contradiction. When discoveries challenge the framework too strongly, they tend to disappear. Not violently, not dramatically, but administratively. Reclassified, dismissed, filed away. The artifacts didn't survive, but the explanations did. And once an explanation becomes the only thing left, the discovery itself no longer needs to exist. None of these discoveries were destroyed. They weren't erased. They weren't banned. They were explained. Each one received an answer that sounded reasonable, comfortable, final. And once an explanation feels sufficient, curiosity becomes unnecessary. The files are closed, the questions stop, and history moves forward, lighter, simpler, quieter. But explanations don't always end mysteries.
Sometimes, they just replace them. And what disappears isn't the discovery itself, but the permission to keep asking.